Hello. I recently read a play titled M. Butterfly by David Henry Wang for school, and I was compelled by the plot, wherein René Gallimard, the French diplomat, meets Song Lilling, a Chinese opera actor, while he is performing the lead role in Puccini's Madame Butterfly, which is a female role. Gallimard falls for Lilling and participates in a 20-year affair with him. What Gallimard doesn't know is that Song Lilling is a man who has been spying on him so that he can report back to the Chinese government on the French. The component of the story that I found so compelling is how Song's character serves as such effective commentary on the fantasy that Western men have for Asian women, and how that propels the rampant fetishization of Asian women in Western culture. Song knows exactly what Gallimard expects from his portrayal of a Chinese woman, and he curates the perfect persona of said woman to appeal to Gallimard, who is mostly unquestioning of this performance. Song can present whatever traits and values he needs to keep Gallimard's fantasy alive. In fact, Gallimard goes to incredible lengths to overlook aspects of their relationship that, to many, would make it obvious that something was off. Some argue that perhaps he even knew that Song was a man, but the fantasy that Song provided was too satisfying for him to care. It was an entertaining read. After a lifetime of witnessing friends be subject to racial fetishization and seeing the men around me talk about things like yellow fever, I'll admit, I liked reading a story that uses a white man's ignorance towards the woman he fetishized to lead to his ultimate downfall, which I'll talk about later. For now, I want to introduce the main question that I was left with when I stepped away from M. Butterfly, which is, where did Western men's fetish for Southeastern Asian women start? I thought it would be interesting to look at the roots of this racial fetish and analyze it and how it developed through time, following the timeline of the media that M. Butterfly was inspired by, and how that media affected the culture, starting with Madame Chrysanthemum, and then the different versions of Madame Butterfly, which led to Puccini's final and the most popular version. When I started researching for this video, my first steps were to read up on the fetishization of Asian cultures in a broad sense. I wanted to know how it started and what its causes were, historically speaking. I thought it would help me to understand better what I was writing about before specifically reading articles that would help me relate the history of fetishization back to the series of media I'd chosen to look at this phenomena through. I was surprised to find that in many of the articles and essays I was reading, Madame Chrysanthemum and Madame Butterfly were already being mentioned by the authors. I wanted to open with that because I think it's quite telling of the impact that these pieces of media had on the fetishization and fantasy of Asian women in the Western world. Which leads me to ask, what is the role of media in fantasy and fetish? When speaking on the impact of opera and literature on society in the 18th and 19th centuries, Antonio Gramsci, an Italian Marxist philosopher, linguist, journalist, writer, and politician, writes that these mediums, quote, served the purpose of entertainment or escape from the reality of daily life, but their effects had the power of something deeply felt and experienced. While people were taking part in the consumption of the arts as a form of escapism more than ever, they were also being thrust into a world where, without learned media literacy, one could form a artificial, cliché, and diluted view on social relations. The opera provides the feeling of something deeply felt and experienced, yet, of course, being fictional, could fuel one's personal fantasy through this public shared fantasy. In her essay, Popular Culture, Public and Private Fantasies, Feminism and Fetishism in David Cronenberg's M. Butterfly, Teresa de Laurentiis describes fantasy as a fundamental human activity based on the capacity for imagining and imaging, for making images in one's mind, imagining, and making images in material expressions, imaging. In his book, The Interpretation of Dreams, Freud identified wish fulfillment as a central dream function. This applies not only to dreams during sleep, but also to daydreams or waking fantasies, where unmet needs are represented as fulfilled. For example, sexual desires or narcissistic fantasies. In her essay, de Laurentiis argues that public forms of media fulfill the same wish fulfillment that Freud suggests of private fantasies. But instead of just for the individual viewer, it is for society. Quote, His Majesty the Ego is the hero alike of every daydream, every story. In this sense, the narrative inscribed in popular culture forms and their scenarios or mise-en-scene, complete with characters, passions, conflicts, and resolutions, may be considered public fantasies. One might ask oneself, in this case, what the fantasy being represented in a piece of media is, and if there is a hero that represents the ego of its creator. In Asian American Women's Body Image Experiences, a qualitative intersectionality study, it is said that, historically, and as a Western tool to justify imperial aspirations, Asia has been romanticized and exotified to the masses. For us to understand the context for the public fantasies that were enjoyed by Western consumers of Madame Chrysanthemum, we thus need a brief understanding of the world that it was born into. History. Okay. The image of Japan for those in France during the 1850s and 1860s was one painted by the introduction of Japanisme. After Japanese ports reopened to trade with the West in 1853, a tidal wave of foreign imports flooded European shores. Woodcut prints from the ukiyo-e school were especially popular, the style of which was taken up by Impressionist and Post-Impressionist artists, and transformed the art world in France. Suddenly, Japan was introduced to many Europeans through the lens of art created by artists like Manet and Degas. In 1868, Japan's Meiji Restoration replaced the shogunate with a centralized imperial government, thus ending French influence as advisors on the military stage. Also, France's defeat by Prussia in 1870 further weakened its standing on the world stage. As Japan rapidly industrialized and built military strength, it emerged as a serious challenge to Western dominance, leading French media by the 1890s to portray Japan as the Yellow Prussians of East Asia. During this pivotal time, at the turn of the century, no French work had such impact in shaping attitudes toward Japan as Madame Chrysanthemum. Madame Chrysanthemum, an 1887 novel by Pierre Loti. Madame Chrysanthemum is an autobiographical novel that follows Pierre Loti, a French naval officer who was stationed in Nagasaki as part of his service. The book is about his experience in Japan, which includes his temporary marriage with a Japanese woman whom he named Chrysanthemum. In his book, Loti first expresses a fascination with the unfamiliar and exotic. He portrays Japan as a strange, beautiful, and decorative world, something to be observed and experienced. He seems drawn to fulfill a romanticized fantasy of the East, much like a tourist. But Loti was disappointed by his time in Japan, which is clear in his writing. His knowledge of Japan had been formed by the aforementioned Japanisme that had taken off in France. Quote, Loti's universe, his ideal Japan, would have been aristocratic, the noble samurai, the exquisite geisha of his woodblock print dreams, now sullied by a modernizing Japan. Loti and much of Europe clung to an idealized traditional image of Japan, rooted in tea houses, woodblock prints, and religious art. Despite the rapid modernization of the Meiji era, as Japan embraced Western-style progress, the romantic vision faded into disillusionment. The shift was especially unsettling to some because Japan's modernization closely mirrored Europe's own, making the changes feel eerily familiar and thus threatening. You can feel a sense of contempt coming through Loti as he writes about Japan. His interest was not truly in Japan as a country, but in expressing his dissatisfaction with change and with the extinction of his childhood dreams of the marvelous and exotic that he sought to find. As one 1887 reviewer put it, Madame Chrysanthemum is not a novel, but it is a page of memories. This disinterest in gaining a deeper understanding and sense of empathy towards the culture, misguided by a shield of his own insecurity and disappointment, led Loti to impose his own cynical perspective on Japanese women, and culture, thus, as a whole. He writes them as extremely sexual beings who aimed only to please. He describes them as groveling at his feet. Also, Loti seems to have disliked Chrysanthemum for his own inability to experience stirrings of emotion for her, even though he played the master and received her ritualized formal attentiveness, about which he says he should find amusing in anyone else, irritates me in her. Loti wrote that the women of the East were petite and doll-like, and no more human than ornaments. Although this was a work of fiction, Loti's novel was highly successful. It was translated into several different languages and read across the world. Loti presented Chrysanthemum as a superficially splendid, marginally charming woman of no great importance, and through her, Japan was small and precious, an amusing trifle of a country. With affected weariness, Lottie exclaims, "I really make a sad abuse of the adjective petite. I am quite aware of it, but how can I do otherwise?" This description of Japan had real-world consequences. During the Russo-Japanese War, Charles Petit described Japan as dangerous and ferocious, populated by little men, both ruthless and energetic, echoing Lottie's earlier warning of a little people which will be among the family of yellow races, the breeding ground of hatred against our white races. In Chrysanthemum, Lottie insistently encoded the threat of Japanese manufacturers as imitative decadence, while Commander Rancière Lanoury reported from Yokohama, saying, in reference to Japanese people, quote, "They have created nothing, perfected or improved nothing, and have always remained inferior even in their imitation," which you'll notice is quite similar to Lottie's previous quote. It was thought to be true that the Japanese possessed elements of the West, but were not truly a modern people. In one review in 1926, a writer says, "I believe that the contempt for the Japanese expressed in Lottie's books in some measure influenced the Russians to refuse Japan's request, and led to the Russo-Japanese War of 1904. The Russian court was open to French influence. Lottie's bitter version of Chrysanthemum was consistent with versions of France's Japan as a land not truly civilized and a place of tenacious duty and heartless honor, of mothers sending their sons out into Japan's armies and selling off their daughters to brothels, never to know the anguish of loss." It didn't help the world's view of Japan that Lottie denied his Japan the capacity to suffer a broken heart, to anguish at separation, and to know sentiment and intimate feeling through his version of Chrysanthemum. That being said, not everyone accepted Pierre Loti's portrayal of Japan as definitive. His novel Madame Chrysanthemum filtered Japan through a narrow, self-centered lens, presenting the country as a decorative setting for his own imperial fantasies rather than a culture deserving of understanding. Chrysanthemum herself was rendered emotionally flat, little more than an exotic backdrop to Lottie's naval adventure. In response, Félix Regami, a French artist and serious student of Japanese culture, rewrote the story in 1893 from Chrysanthemum's perspective in The Pink Notebook of Madame Chrysanthemum. His version sought to rewrite the image of Japan in Europe by giving Chrysanthemum emotional depth, reimagining her as the daughter of a noble family devastated by foreign intrusion. Regami's Chrysanthemum experiences genuine longing and heartbreak, her suicide becoming a symbol of both despair and national dislocation. While Regami seemed to want to improve the image of Japan in France through his writing, he does this while still using his fictional story about a woman as a pawn to represent what he believed to be true of Asian women. Around the same time in the United States, similar themes emerged in John Luther Long's Madame Butterfly and its 1900 stage adaptation by David Belasco, which would become the basis for Puccini's opera. While the world was seeing the rise of anti-Asian sentiment, restrictive immigration policies, and racialized fears of yellow peril, Long's story portrays Cho-Cho-San as a woman who assimilates into American ideals, converting to Christianity, speaking English, and envisioning a life in the U.S., only to be abandoned by her American lover. Her tragic arc reveals the one-sided nature of East-West encounters. While Japan had opened itself to the West, Western nations remained closed to cultural exchange. In the opera, Butterfly's suicide not only marks her personal devastation, but also clears the way for the American Pinkerton and his white wife to claim her child, erasing the mixed-race bond that represented a potential challenge to racial and national boundaries. Madame Butterfly, a 1904 opera by Giacomo Puccini. By the time that the opera by Puccini was on stage, the emotional blueprint of stories like Madame Chrysanthemum and Madame Butterfly had already embedded a lasting image of Japan and its women in Western imagination, one that Puccini's 1904 opera would fully crystallize. Built on John Luther Long's short story and David Belasco's stage adaptation, Madame Butterfly tells the story of a devoted Japanese woman abandoned by her American lover, echoing an imperial narrative of betrayal, fetishization, and disposability. This play gained traction during a time ravaged by exclusionary U.S. immigration policies and racialized anxieties about Asian modernity and assimilation. Butterfly, who adopts Christianity, speaks English, and dreams of life in Pinkerton's American castle, is ultimately discarded, a tragic symbol of failed cross-cultural longing. Despite this, or maybe particularly because of it, Madame Butterfly became a worldwide success. While the butterfly's exoticism and maîtredom made her palatable to Western audiences, Japan's reactions to the opera were often conflicted, with some artists creating their own versions of the play to reclaim their culture. Madame Butterfly recycles tropes like geisha submissiveness, ritual suicide, and sacrificial love, all culminating in the idea that Japanese women are designed to be romanticized, used, and erased. The opera's popularity had a large part in shaping a persistent, racialized stereotype of Asian women as loyal, passive, and ultimately disposable figures within Western culture. Dr. Leilani Nishimi, professor of communication at the Washington University, stated in a panel presentation saying, "Butterfly has created, for us, an image that all Asian women are disposable, that those bodies can be easily replaced for someone else more desirable. It also paints a picture of absolute loyalty to those people who want to dominate and abuse." M. Butterfly, a 1988 play by David Henry Hwang. David Henry Hwang's M. Butterfly serves as a counter to Puccini's Madame Butterfly, reworking the fantasy of the submissive Asian woman to expose the phenomena of this particular kind of racism. Drawing on the real-life affair between French diplomat Bernard Bourrisseau and Chinese opera singer Sheng Ping-Piu, Hwang flips the script by replacing the self-sacrificing Cho Cho-san with the cunning, self-inventing Song Liling, an opera singer, a spy, and a man who seduces Gallimard by weaponizing the very stereotypes the West romanticizes. While Gallimard clings to the essentialist notions of femininity, race, and the East, reading Song's demureness, modesty, and oriental mystique as markers of authenticity, Song consciously performs these tropes, turning Gallimard's fantasy back on him. Hwang dismantles the Western imperial gaze by exposing how desire is not directed at a person, but an illusion, a fantasy created and consumed by the West. In M. Butterfly, the tragedy is not in a woman's death, but in a man's collapse when confronted with the falsity of the narrative he's clung to, forcing audiences to reckon with the destructive power of myth and the violence embedded in the fetishization of the East. Ultimately, at the end of the play, Gallimard dresses up as a geisha, as Song would have been when they met, and slits his throat, as Butterfly does in the original play by Puccini, so that he can be with his fantasy forever. Let's talk about where we are now. It's important to critically examine whether outside influences are affecting the way that we treat people we interact with, both in day-to-day life and in any sexual context, including pornography. The media that we consume and the cultures in which we live can have a large impact on our subconscious thoughts. I've had many a long, drawn-out conversation with a man who didn't understand why I was telling him that it's not okay to have a fetish for a particular race. All of these men, of course, were white. I tried to explain that it's fine to like who you like, but as soon as you start seeking out people of only a certain race, because of physical or personal qualities that you assume they will possess, you are feeding into the fetishization of entire race. In these men, there was no inclination to look more deeply into the way that they felt. Mostly a defensiveness, seeking to protect their right to mindlessly view women with whatever sexual lens they see fit, so long as they were enjoying it. There seems to be a misconception still around racial preferences on behalf of white people that the mere fact of enjoying something means it doesn't deserve introspection. In the Ask an Asian Girl segment of the article The Madame Butterfly Effect, this anonymous quotation was provided. Mixed Asians, particularly women, are supposed to be so beautiful in this reductive, exoticizing way. She writes, "It's a positive stereotype at that, but nonetheless lazily shoves varied and uncategorizable experiences and appearances into a convenient, positively neutral and vague myth. As exposed by research of the sociological development of the Asian American female identity, a sizable portion of Asian American women find themselves voiceless during social or intimate situations. This representation of the self has been institutionalized and normalized by prevalent racial stereotypes that define Asian women as either obedient, docile mutes, or exotic toys. The fetishization of Asian women has mutated over time, with changing awareness and political climates, but is very much still rampant and misunderstood today. If you were to ask any friend if they've ever witnessed the fetishization of Asian women and their culture, I'm confident that anyone would say yes. We have been fed content for so long that perpetuates untrue generalizations and fantasies about Asian women that Westerners have used to feed their reductive and harmful fetish. So be aware of the way that you think about other races in relation to fetish and fantasy, and always ask yourself why.